said, Africa at one point, for over 100 years, had to be governed, had to be directed and ushered into what other people think was right for us. And having to break through that cycle requires some form of strength. And I believe the African Liberation Movement, or they, had everything to do with the idea that we need to take charge of our own destiny, and there was a need for Africa to progress like its Western counterpart, and there was a need for Africa to secure its own economy, its own political future. More or less, it was born out of the idea of wanting to be independent, the true meaning of independence. And you cannot have independence if you do not have control of how you want to be governed or how you want the outside world to regard you. And in that respect, Africa seemed to have basically set itself a task, which was not only to gain independence, not only to be politically free or sovereign free. It had to be able to seek the betterment of its own people and the betterment of itself. So in that respect, I think, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I say something, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, definitely. We have
this is very well here. I think the history is important, but what I think it's really more imperative right now is the fact that, and most people have not really been paying attention to this, is the fact that 50 years after the founding fathers and mothers of the OAU met and designated this day African Liberation Day, I'm talking of the 25th of May, what has happened? If you fast forward 50 years later, we are living in a new imperial moment. Mm-hmm. And this is really what, for me, is more important. Because, yes, there's a history of slavery. There is a history of colonization. And then after colonization, of course, we were situated within the Cold War ideological situation wherein African states had very little, of course, the ideological competition between the West and the East produced this kind of situation in which African states were caught up between the rock and the hard place. And then the neo-colonial system that has been instituted since independence still continues, of course, to affect African states. So, yes, sometimes we talk about corruption in terms of our leaders who are corrupt, but in actual fact, it's not only the things that we do or we have not been able to do on the ground, but it's actually situating our condition within the larger global structural constraints and systemic constraints that exist that makes it very difficult for Africans to be able to realize their freedom, economic prosperity, and all of that. And fast forward 50 years later, let me just complete this, please. 50 years later, we are now in a new imperial moment where if you go to Africa, yes, Africans are in charge, but in actual fact, policies are being made by the World Bank and the IMF and the UN. Our poor are being fed by the NGOs. So we are actually in this place where 50 years later, looking back, we are back to square one. I think that's really the point that I wanted to make. And this is why this day is probably supposed to be really, really important for us.
Can I just word in quickly, Zuba? What I think it's African liberation is special is that it's in a nutshell, it's somehow the first ever opportunity for Africa to take charge of its own destiny. And I think that is why we need to value the day, not only value it, we need to look at it in the sense that it is the first ever opportunity we ever had or craved to be where we are. Or else we would not have gone even halfway, even with all these constraints you've highlighted, we would not have been where we are if this day had not been initiated.
If I can come in, Charles, can I come in? I just wanted to quickly say.
I think we'll delve into this actually in the next question, because the next question is going to be talking about whether Africans are really truly liberated. think we're in a good juncture where we can actually go now to part 2. For time constraints, I would like to go to part 2 now. Question 2 of part 1, sorry. Is that yes, Safa? You'll have an opportunity for a second for the next question after the 2 main speakers have spoken. Guys, there's good stuff in for question 1. All the participants, you actually raised good points, and I'm sure all the 5 panelists actually have their own views of where Africa is and what's going on. I'm sure they're all keen to share their views with our listeners. Well, question 2, we'll be talking about independence and African liberation and whether Africa is truly liberated. Just a bit of background. 50 years ago, we said earlier, in the 60s, with the exception of South Africa and some West African countries like Namibia and Zimbabwe, we had our independence. Efforts to liberate Africa had actually started a long time ago in the mid-19th century. They've discussed slogans like Africa for Africans, which was popularized by Marcus Garvey, and the declaration of the Negro movement in 1920. And there's even reason to believe, despite what I think an earlier panelist has said, that he actually could have originated in West Africa, Sierra Leone, and taken to the Caribbean. But then, that's just another view. The OAU was then formed in 1953. It was widely criticized as it was very bureaucratic. It was just like a talking shop with no power. It actually struggled to enforce its decisions. It lacked the armed force, and intervention was really rare. We saw civil wars in Nigeria, Angola. We mentioned Sierra Leone. Africa virtually hasn't got any technology or industry. We send our raw materials out to Europe, America, and Asia. Why are we doing all this? Why are we not doing things for ourselves? To that, I'll pose this question to Zuba Y. Zuba, 50 years after independence and all that we've gone through, in your opinion, is Africa really liberated?
No, and that's really the point that I was saying. But this is not a yes or no question. It is more complex than it might seem. Because, and I think one of the speakers, I think it was Emil, who was drawing attention to the fact that we have made progress over the years. I'll give you an example. In Sierra Leone, for instance, we like to talk about the Athens of West Africa, which is actually a misnomer. The British brought education. Sierra Leone was the center for the propagation of education. But by the time the British left in 1961, it was actually 8% of the population that was educated. The advancement of literacy in Sierra Leone took place in the post-independence era. So take somebody like Shaka Stevens that we blame for the country's problems. It was actually under him that we were able to expand education to about 32% of the population. Now, of course, there were problems in the fact that we were unable to provide jobs, and then there were problems of corruption. But I'm just giving you an example that even when the British were talking about Athens of West Africa, the amount of people that were educated during this period compared to the very short time, 18 years after independence, far outweighed over 200 years of British rule in Sierra Leone. So there are issues where, and the anti-colonial movement was of course important in the sense that, the fact that some of us could come to these parts of the world now, even though racism still exists, but the fact that we could go elsewhere, you have Africans all over the place. The civil rights movements here in connection to the anti-colonial movement in Africa were very significant. So in that sense, you could say, yes, Africans are in charge of governing their own states. However, on a larger structural level, imperialism is very much alive. And this is the point I was making earlier, that we are actually in a new imperial moment in which all of the gains that we made after independence during the anti-colonial struggle, were squandered by the first generation of leaders, partly because of their own failings, but partly because of the constraints that they inherited, and the constraints of global political economy and the asymmetrical power relations, but also the fact that the Western governments themselves want these states to be at their beck and call. Because if you watch, Africa is still very rich in resources. So the only way in which you want every African, whether it's Nkrumah or Sankara, Lumumba, all of those Africans who had said, let's do it our own way, were killed one way or the other. So it's only they encourage all of these crazy guys who will be in power, who are at their beck and call. So to answer your question, it's very complex, but at this stage, given that we are in a new imperial moment where the West is actually dictating who should be leaders in our countries, what kind of policies that we'll have in place, I don't think Africa is anywhere near liberated. And this is why we need to keep fighting.
Thank you.
Okay, Charles, can I come in? I just wanted to say...
Can I please come in?
Charles.
Okay,
hello?
Safa, 1 minute, and then Caroline will come in because it was meant to be Caroline. But Safa, you go 1 minute.
Okay, I just wanted to say, Zubai is actually right on the money. We should ask ourselves, are we liberated? The question is, what should liberation look like? For me, it is not having, independence and celebrating it every year. It means being able to feed our children. It means being able to provide safe water for our people. It means being able to prevent conflicts on the continent. And it means being able to hold our own when it comes to relations with other powers. And that is really what people who fought for African liberation from the beginning, and all of the Pan-Africanists who formed the OAU, wanted to do, and this is what we should be focused on. Today, we know that we have control, some measure of control over our own government. At least we elect them every year. If that is important, in terms of having a democracy, we know that we have that. But beyond that, we need to have a system wherein we are able to provide the basic necessities, beyond basic necessities, in fact, wherein we are able to guarantee the well-being of our people and to be able to provide a peaceful and stable environment for them.
Yes, Brother Charles, after the sister, could I throw some light on what the brothers have just commented?
Emil, I would like to go to Caroline next.
Okay. Yeah.
Just going back on what Safari said briefly, for Africa to be really, really liberated, we should be free, we should be enjoying all the amenities that we in the West here enjoy. They should have running water, children should be going to school, they should have jobs when they finish. That's when I think true liberation will have taken effect. Caroline, could you share your opinion on that?
Yes, please.
Africa is truly liberated?
Yes, Charles, I think Africa is not still liberated, and Africans are also still not liberated. You saw the statement or Sajiko Dr. Kwame Nkrumah made on the eve of independence of Ghana should be looked at again and should be considered. Yeah. On that day, he said the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. He was sending a strong message to all Africans, I think because he saw the potential on the continent, both human and natural resources. And at that time, he was trying to appeal to the conscience of all Africans that regardless of our predicament, there is still hope. We can still make it without depending on anyone. That once we have gained our independence, there was no turning back. That we should mobilize, and take control of our destiny. But unfortunately, that statement was not taken seriously. So what do we see today? We are still dependent on the Western world. The passion, which Nkrumah used to make that statement on that day, to inform all of us that we can take our destiny into our own hands. You could see that he really meant every word he said.
Yeah, actually,
and we should liberate our minds.
That's very
our minds are not yet liberated.
That's true, mental slavery. That's true. I actually had a discussion, I think it was with Safari a while back, or 2 weeks ago. We were actually saying that Africa needs to go back to what Nkrumah had suggested a while back. So it was good that you mentioned Nkrumah there, actually. Emil, you wanted to come in, please?
Thanks, Brother Charles. To buttress what Sister Caroline just said, independence. Most of African states just had flag and anthem. And the question we need to ask as Africans is, when we say Africa is liberated, at whose expense or who's benefiting?